The question is, what can I do to be better tomorrow than I am today? That's the question. And EMDRIA has chosen a conscious intent to try to inculcate that quality and that characteristic and that commitment into everything it does. It doesn't mean there won't be any standards. There will be, and we're working on them across the board. But the intent is to be embracing and to try to capture as much of the universe, because if we're going to create global healing, health, and hope, we have to be able to scale, and we have to be as inclusive as we can.
Michael Bowers, welcome to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah. Michael, so before we start talking about EMDRIA and EMDR in the world, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Relevant to this conversation, I trained in family therapy at the academic programs of accredited marriage and family therapy programs. I attended the University of Maryland, and in my work there worked a lot in my clinical work with inner city and juvenile justice systems. That was where I did a lot of my actual clinical training. What I discovered in the US relatively quickly was that while psychotherapy was recognized, family therapy, conjoint therapies were not, and recognized very well. So a job opening, I saw an advertisement in the Washington Post for a job at the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and applied. When I went into interview, discovered that the husband of one of my professors in my program at the University of Maryland had just become the executive director of AAMFT, which surprised us both when I walked in. I was hired and spent 7 years there working in legislative areas related to family therapy and recognition of family therapy, became the executive director, and served for 20 years as the executive director of AAMFT, and spent most of my time working on advocacy, organizational development, recognition for family therapy while I was there leading that organization. I went for a while to work with the American Physical Therapy Association as their CEO, and later then was recruited to, when EMDRIA had an opening, joined EMDRIA in 2017, primarily hired, I think, because of my prior advocacy work and recognition work for the profession of marriage and family therapy, and have been here since March of 2017.
So March of 2017, that's almost 8 years, and a lot has happened in EMDRIA since then. Is that right?
Yeah, EMDRIA has more than doubled in its membership. Our budget has tripled, and we have seen a lot of programmatic growth. We also experienced a global pandemic, which was quite a challenge for us to work with our members on how to both deliver services and complete training in a virtual environment when we had not really been built for that purpose in the beginning. But I am proud of the growth of the organization overall and the depth. It's not just grown taller. I think we've also grown deeper in some pretty significant ways.
I have a lot of questions about the shift to working virtually during the pandemic and a lot of the programs, but I want to start by asking you about the mission and the vision of EMDRIA and how it aligns with Francine Shapiro's mission and vision that she had in the early days. And obviously, EMDR changed a lot, and the legitimacy or the acceptance of EMDR changed a lot. I'm wondering if you can talk about the mission and vision of EMDRIA and how it aligns with Francine's original mission and vision.
I'll probably do I guess a cut to the past. I guess if you were doing video editing or something, as well as discussing a cut to the future. Before I came to EMDRIA, the EMDRIA board had adopted what is the tagline now as a part of the sort of DNA of the organization. And the tagline that they adopted was creating global healing, health, and hope. And obviously, if you think about that, they spent a lot of time coming up with those few words. Healing, health, and hope obviously is sequential when you look at how a person's progress through a traumatic event. But it also reflects, I think, and really built on what Francine began. And that's really the flashback. Francine, in her organizational work, aside from her work with the Institute, was instrumental in seeing three different entities founded. One was EMDRIA as the membership organization, and it was the first and originally conceived to be a singular organization that would encompass the global EMDR community. For a number of reasons, there grew up a tree of organizations in EMDR, but her original vision was to establish an entity that would be a membership organization for all EMDR professionals, and that was named EMDRIA. Shortly after, a few years after, particularly precipitated by the Oklahoma City bombing, Francine began to build something called the Humanitarian Assistance Program, Trauma Recovery, and now it's known as HAP, which was aimed at dissemination and scaling and reaching into communities where there may not be EMDR available. And she was very focused on making sure that there was a broad penetration of EMDR into areas of need. The third entity that she began and was instrumental in encouraging is something that was always dear to her, which was the EMDR Research Foundation, that focused on building legitimacy for EMDR and making sure that there was sufficient evidence-based and that whatever we did in EMDR was based on evidence, not just proving what had already come to be, but informing the future and making us move. I think the notion of creating global healing, health, and hope that the EMDRIA board adopted in 2016 or early 2017 before I arrived was in some respects, intentionally or unintentionally, a pivot from what I would call the legitimacy battles of EMDR into the scaling and building of EMDR, into pushing it out. It's no secret among anybody who has watched EMDR for very long that there were some very bruising legitimacy battles for the treatment. There was a lot of institutional resistance. Francine didn't come from the high levels of academic psychology. It was a different entry point, and there was a lot of legitimacy battles that had to be fought that left a lot of scars on a lot of folks, honestly. The scars became badges of courage, but nevertheless, they were still scars. So I think making EMDR be legitimate created its own trauma for many people, and they were grappling
lucky
with
you
that.
joining in 2017 when you didn't have to fight so hard for the legitimacy, right?
Correct. That's why I think the tagline actually is an interesting inflection point, because there was an assumption of legitimacy even in that tagline. It wasn't about making sure EMDR is recognized and known, which could also have been a tagline for the organization promoting EMDR. It could have been a legitimate tagline for an organization dedicated to EMDR. But the board chose to talk about the scale and the impact that it wanted to create, which presumed a legitimacy battle was finished, that we had arrived, at least in some respects. And by all evidence, we was some recognition for EMDR with the World Health Organization, with the Department of Defense, with the Department of Veterans Affairs, with the American Psychiatric Association. There had been great progress in that area. And so there was now the question of, what do we do next? What is this organization's DNA going to incorporate, and how is it going to move forward? And my hiring, I think, was connected to the sense of a new vision and more of an external focus of what kind of impact we could make. There were a lot of internal issues that needed to be dealt with in EMDRIA and in the organization. And then we were just beginning to drive that forward when we had the pandemic. So there were a lot of developmental challenges in that. Like any human being, organizations don't develop in a straight line. But I think Francine's vision and what EMDRIA tried to inculcate into its mission and its own vision were very much aligned at different points in time through the developmental cycle.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can talk about, so you joined 2017, And then in 2020, there's the pandemic and everything shifts, right? The world shifts, everything switches to virtual. And I remember prior to the pandemic, there were questions about working virtually. And, one of the people who are joining us live today is Mark Brain, who's been doing this work virtually for a very long time, but most people did not. And I think that EMDRIA's stance on it was, this is not safe. But then I think that actually prior to the pandemic, there was already a task force that was examining what would virtual EMDR look like. So I wonder if you can talk about that and the whole decision-making process.
Yeah, EMDRIA began a couple of initiatives in 2018 to try to envision how to scale and how to create the vision. One was the Council of Scholars. We can probably talk about that in a minute.
Well, definitely.
But related directly to the virtual piece, there had been a lot of discussion about the fact that access to care, when people have to drive to a therapist's office and spend time, it makes the whole enterprise less accessible to people. And the task force that was appointed by the board in 2018 had two charges. Number one was to look at virtual EMDR therapy and to ask what kind of safeguards need to be developed, whether it can feasibly be done, how you would create the kinds of mechanisms that you needed to do for it to be effective, a range of questions that was asked in a charge to the task force to develop guidelines. And the other was to look at virtual training and how there could be a scope and what bits of training could be done virtually. The original question of the task force in that regard was not how can you do virtual training from beginning to end, but what components of the training continuum, like a research review or discussions of the AIP model, at least some lectures, what components could be built into a virtual framework, that there could be a hybrid model of training. That was the question. We had colleagues in Australia who had began to work on some components of online or virtual training. There were other extent models in other areas of treatment. And the task force original assignment was to work on training first and then to come back. And we didn't get more than 2 or 3 months into it. And the task force said, give us something we can succeed at. And virtual EMDR therapy is a less of a lift than trying to figure out the components related to therapy. So it just so happened that the report developing guidelines on virtual therapy was produced at the end of 2019 and was submitted to the board for approval, and the board had approved those guidelines for virtual EMDR and begun to disseminate them. And then March of 2020, we know the world shut down. So that just happened. And the task force had just begun its work on virtual training and what components of virtual training could be legitimately moved as a step toward considering the full implications of virtual training. So that was that process, and it was propitious timing. One could plan for a pandemic to occur. We could not have planned that better, but nobody wanted that to happen. It just meant that we could offer our members resources so they could continue to provide care in an environment where people could not come to an office for therapy. That's the virtual therapy part. The virtual training part is probably a little different. I won't filibuster. I'll let you ask me questions about anything you want.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned the Council of Scholars, and I'm wondering if you can dive into that. What is the Council of Scholars, and what, I guess I can talk about it in past tense, right? What was its role?
Right. When I came to EMDRIA, one of the things that I was aware of, and I actually had conversations with Francine about this, this was most unfortunate timing. If you want to talk about what was propitious timing with virtual therapy guidelines, this was really not good timing. In 2018, I wrote a concept paper called The Future of EMDR Therapy Project. And it was looking at matters of succession because I had had a conversation with Francine about what do you see for EMDR when you aren't here any longer? What happens next? And how do you build processes, mechanisms, organizational structures that could continue to carry on study, research, clinical innovation, maintaining fidelity to evidence, but also giving EMDR a path forward so that it wasn't just what it always was at a point in time, that it could grow. And out of that came what came to be known from the Future of EMDR Therapy project to the Council of Scholars. Francine we invited a group. I don't think it was called a Council of Scholars at the first meeting, where there was a symposium in California in the 2019 annual conference, where about 45 scholars from around the globe, and EMDR scholars and leading thinkers, came together for 2.5 days and began to identify 4 working groups. One is about definitional aspects of what is EMDR. One is about clinical practice and how you would develop clinical practice guidelines. One about education and training, and one about research. What are the research needs for EMDR, for it to drive forward? And these work groups began their work forward. A special issue of the journal was published in 2019. It may have been 2018 when we had the meeting. But at any rate, Francine was going to attend the meeting, the first meeting, 2018, and was unable to attend because of health. But she had given her statement that she was pleased with this effort and she looked forward to see what would happen as a result of it. And then 2019, she passed before any of us were ready for her to go, and before there had really been a building of the capacity of the Council of Scholars to sustain its work and going forward. In 2020, most of the people who were scholars and clinicians had to pull back from their participation because of the pandemic. And it became more a triage. Everybody was working in their own countries to making sure that people could get care, and all of the questions that arose as a result of that pandemic. That created some drag on the progress of the group. And then eventually there got to be some political angst within the EMDR community, affected the council's ability to move forward in a way that was going to be productive. At that point, EMDRIA had invested about $250,000 in this effort and had tried to build and support the meetings and the structure. And the EMDRIA board recognized that there was enough headwind there that this project was going to be consumed by organizational issues rather than the substance of its work, and rather than continue to invest in a way that was going to increase friction, chose to suspend the operation of the Council of Scholars at that time in 2022. That is not the end of the work, but that was the end of that initiative. More, I think, that has been done and will be done, and EMDRIA remains committed to ensuring that there is a formal mechanism, identify research and training agendas that will assist broadly and not just replicate everything that we have already done, that there will be a learning and growing edge to what we do. The EMDRIA board has specifically stated that it wants to engage more in a developmental model of continuous improvement. While we want to be focused on standards and we want to be focused on ensuring that high standards are met, that the goal is to bring as many people along with us toward a path to excellence as we can.
Michael, can you talk about the developmental model with the continuous improvement? What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, everybody begins their EMDR journey with differing levels of expertise and knowledge, whether it is related to trauma, what is related to dissociation, whether it is related to the clinical theories that they were taught in the graduate school program, how much they know about human development, there's a wide array of differences in the different professions, in the different academic programs about how someone enters EMDR therapy training. In fact, in the articles that I have read, and there aren't a lot, but there are some, one of the predictors of people's continued use of EMDR is their readiness for that training and where they enter into that training. That is one of the factors that is considered a predictive factor in how well they will do with EMDR. If you start with that recognition and reality that there is always going to be a different entry point with different levels of knowledge, with different levels of expertise, with different levels of experience, whether it's years in career, whether it's commitment to a prior model, all of those things. The question is, when people enter, what is their next step to become more proficient in the use of EMDR and more skilled and have more depth as a clinician? And that's whether we like it or not, that is the reality at which point people enter. So we have a choice to begin a very strict regulation at that level, or a very strict regulation at the next level. Where do we build our toll gates? And where do we build the measures where we're going to stop people and not let them pass go until they meet certain criteria? That is a legitimate discussion, not only in EMDR, but in all professional training. The EMDRIA board, by adopting a developmental model, has basically taken the perspective that knowing that people begin with different entry points and with different levels of knowledge, is our job to regulate and hold back people at a certain point and not allow them to proceed? Or is our job to take people where they are who are going to be practicing EMDR and can in fact read Francine Shapiro's book and go out and try to do it? They don't even have to go to training. That book is published in many different languages now. It's widely disseminated. If somebody wishes, they can go do it yourself EMDR training by biblio education, right? They can read a book.
Yeah.
So we want to take people who have entered the training regimen and work with them where they are and begin to build a knowledge in their set of skills, and as much as possible, develop a pathway and for people who enter our training, for people who are going to be certified, for people who are going to be consultants, and for people who are going to be trainers. It is where we draw our gates and where we create the stops and where we create the opportunities for people to learn and grow. It's not a question, wherever one is in their career, however skilled one is, it's not a question of how good you are or how elite you are or how advanced you are. The question is, what can I do to be better tomorrow than I am today? That's the question. And EMDRIA has chosen a conscious intent to try to inculcate that quality and that characteristic and that commitment into everything it does. It doesn't mean there won't be any standards. There will be, and we're working on them across the board. But the intent is to be embracing and to try to capture as much of the universe, because if we're going to create global healing, health, and hope, we have to be able to scale, and we have to be as inclusive as we can. Probably more than you ever wanted to know about that, Rodham, but that's
No, I actually am really interested. And I'm also, in previous conversations, you shared the percentage of EMDRIA members who go towards certification, this is where people really get better at doing EMDR, right? There's only so much you can get at a basic training, which again gives you the foundation, but then you get into the real world. Then you go to your office and see your clients and start using EMDR, and certification is where people really get better. So I'm wondering if you can share these numbers and kind of your thoughts on it.
Sure. Yeah, I think the question is whether basic training should be called foundations in EMDR or whether it should be called basic training. I think that's probably a conversation for another day. But I think it does matter in how you frame and how you think about it, because foundations is more a developmental approach. It sort of sets people up on that pathway, and I think the language matters. But EMDRIA now has a little over 17,000 members, and of those, 14,000 have some credential with EMDRIA, and that about 10,000 are certified therapists who have gone and taken the additional certification and continuing education. About 1,500 are consultants in training. 2,400 or so are consultants, and then 340 people are approved trainers in EMDRIA. So if you take that number, aggregate it, add it up, out of the 17,000, 70% of EMDRIA's members are ones who have bought in and committed to continuous learning and to trying to increase their skills and increase their knowledge. And so capturing that and recognizing our members' commitments that they've already made, right? They've already said, we want to get better. We are committed to a continual learning process. That's what we want to be. We're going to do this every 2 years. We're going to hold ourselves to more education. We're going to drive that forward. It's sort of a natural fit for the organization to adopt that stance.
Yeah, I want to let our members who join us love an opportunity to ask your questions. But before that, I want just a few minutes to hear about the Global Alliance and what happened there. What happened with the Global Alliance? I know there was a big initiative, a very important one. Yeah, there's just a lot of people talking, and I just wanted to ask you what is going on with the Global Alliance.
Yeah, this is, I perfectly fine to present the perspective that I have on this, knowing that it is one perspective among many. I have to sort of preface it with saying this is my own lived experience with what has occurred. Global Alliance has for years had a high ideals that I respect and am committed and to seeing achieved. The debate in the Global Alliance, as I have come to interpret it in my own experience, has to do in some respects with what I've just described about where do you draw the lines and where do you create the gates, and where do you regulate or do you develop, and how do you manage and draw the line there, and what constitutes quality in EMDR training and EMDR standards. And that what really occurred was EMDRIA had, since well before I arrived at EMDRIA, a principle and a practice of what I would call reciprocity. That if people were trained by someone who was approved trainer, recognized one of the regions in EMDR, EMDRIA would accept those individuals as members. We treated the training as equivalent to, and so whatever the standard was that you had, EMDRIA would recognize that. In the other regions, that reciprocity was generally not returned. So that if someone was trained by an EMDRIA approved trainer, they would not be deemed to be trained appropriately in EMDR such that they could become a member of that other organization. That existed prior to my arrival at EMDRIA and became more of an issue with the advent of virtual training, where boundaries didn't matter and where people could access training by a trainer of their choice. And it got to be a situation where EMDRIA was asked in meetings to not tell its trainers, to instruct its trainers not to accept people outside of the US or Canada for training. Or if people said, no, I want to be trained by this person, those people were no longer eligible to be members of the EMDR associations in their own country. That was effectively a very hard issue to reconcile, because EMDRIA, with a lot of things with the US, I mean, EMDRIA has a hard time restricting commerce for a whole host of legal reasons in the US, as this was deemed. And it's difficult if you're just have something on a web page and somebody signs up from Hong Kong or signs up from somewhere else saying, I want to be in your training, for people to actually regulate that. But we found we were beginning to leave a lot of professional orphans, people who had been trained in by trainers who were EMDRIA approved, but who were living in other parts of the world who could no longer join their local EMDR organizations. And at some point there, you had to choose whether it is appropriate to leave people as those kinds of orphans or to create some mechanism for them to join and be a part of EMDRIA. And obviously, if somebody has completed an EMDRIA approved training, we have no reason to reject their membership based on where they live. So that got to be a very significant tension. And the EMDRIA board had several long discussions among itself. It spent a lot of time reviewing a lot of material written. It asked some questions about the ethical implications of it, and decided to write to the Global Alliance leaders and say, we know the policies that exist in the Global Alliance. The policies basically say, you won't come into our territory, we won't go into yours. There were a lot of policies that were actually very geographically specific. And we said in the board's letter, it's not okay for us to leave people as orphans, as isolated. Please, you won't accept them as members. We can't abide by a policy that an environment where people who are legitimately trained in EMDR have no place to go and have no community with whom to affiliate. And therefore, we are withdrawing from the Global Alliance because we see an irreconcilable conflict between the imperative that we have to create global healing, health, and hope, and to scale and to give people opportunities to learn and do EMDR, with the fact that they would be excluded from membership and participation in a collegial and sister EMDR organization. EMDRIA hasn't been aggressive in pursuing sort of a global initiative. There was a lot of question as to whether we would be active or whether, to use a sort of religious metaphor, going into all the world and recruiting people, or whether we would say anyone who wishes to come may come. I mean, that's the EMDRIA has taken so far, as we want to be a welcoming place, but we are not we are not actively going out and to aggressively create disruptions where there are organized entities. But that doesn't resolve all the conflicts, because if there are pockets of people who have been trained by EMDRIA approved trainers who still cannot join their local organizations, we still don't want to leave them with no ability to organize and participate in a community of colleagues and peers where they can actually have that kind of community and develop themselves so they can be more effective as clinicians. So that's as fair and an honest representation as I think I can give of EMDRIA's experience and some of the dynamics that created the current context.
Okay, I have that perspective. Michael, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Go out and do good work. That's why we do what we do, is so you can do what you do. So thank you.